You tell me, Clemens, when
Yeah,
everybody's
I
in.
think you can start.
I can start.
Yes.
Amazing.
Perfect.
So, hi, Bob and Stephen. Welcome to the second round of Zoom with the Legends. And we have asked you to join us because you've got an amazing list of productions going on, as Inception, Looper, Transcendence, Domino. I've got a list here: The Prestige, Walk the Line, Species, The Quick and the Dead. That's something from my childhood. And you both worked on my favorite movie of all times, which is The Dark Knight Rises. So I want to start off with a question. How do you prep a movie like that, as big as that, stunts? And
Actually,
what happens when you
Steve
prep a
was with
stunt?
me, Steve was with me on The Dark Knight.
Not The Dark Knight Rises, but also The Dark Knight.
No, did you do something on Dark Knight Rises?
No, I wasn't on that one.
Oh, I suck.
No, he was on a bigger movie. So, yeah, how do you start prepping something? How do you start prepping a movie with a camera that almost no one knows how to use? And there's only 4 of them. That was a very scary time in my career trying to figure all that out. The movie, actually, I think we started sometime in maybe mid-March, but early or late January, early February, I went up to Canada to look over the facility and the equipment and see what we might need to make changes with. And Wally had already kind of gone over some of the equipment, and so we had a list of things that we needed for them to improve, and one of them was the video, and the IMAX camera was just really terrible, really terrible. The eyepiece was so bad that the operator almost couldn't see focus. And in most cases, he couldn't see focus, and the video was even worse than the eyepiece. So that was quite concerning. That was on our list for them to fix. And just to give you an idea of how IMAX operates, I go into their room where they had installed a new video tap in the camera. Now the camera's on a bench that is completely stripped down. It's just the guts of the camera there that they've got a video camera hooked up to, and they have a lens on it, so you're seeing a chart, and there's a TV showing the image, and the image is just absolutely spotless. And I'm very thrilled, and I tell the guys, this is fantastic. This is exactly what we need. And then they let me down by saying, well, the only problem is we're still looking for a computer small enough to go into the camera. Like, why do you need a computer? Well, the video tap that they put in the camera was a VGA tap. And a VGA tap is, I don't know if anyone is aware, that's what the early video for computers, the cameras on computers were, VGA cameras. And they were very good, but they required a computer to run. And guess what? They didn't get a computer in time. So we did The Dark Knight with the operator barely able to see through the camera, with even worse video. And as a bonus, the electronic noise generated by the IMAX camera completely disabled both a Panatape and a Cinetape, so there was no reference for focus with a large format lens camera. So that was quite interesting.
And I'll just add to that. I mean, the testing that we did we tried so hard to make either the Panatape or the Cinetape work with those IMAX cameras. Just hours of testing, and all kinds of MacGyver, to do shielding to try to shield the signal that was being generated with all the motors in the camera. And sometimes we'd get a little hit, and sometimes we wouldn't, and then we just went back and forth and back and forth. It was just extremely frustrating. And even to date, those eyepieces aren't really that much better. I mean, I remember very clearly a big sequence that was shot on Dunkirk with the operator had no clue where the focus was, and we had to reshoot pretty extensive scenes.
The one good eyepiece was actually Dan Sasaki at Panavision made, and he took an eyepiece from an old Aeroflex camera, like a 2C or an Arri 3, and reconfigured it and actually gave a fairly good viewing eyepiece for that camera.
But then that means that you had to do it the old school way, basically, then
Yeah.
with a tape measure or a laser.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of like old school back to the point of when you had a rack over camera, and the operator would rack over at the end because no one knew what was in focus until they racked into the taking lens.
But then, I mean, I would feel a little bit insecure if I didn't have my my Cinetape working.
Well, I was prepared to be fired at almost any moment.
But that didn't happen. I mean, I've seen the movie.
No, and actually then on when they did Interstellar, I was having a knee operation and I missed out on that one. But the guys figured out some shielding that gave them, they were able to use a Cinetape with all the shielding that they said seemed to work throughout the movie. We had the same thing on Dark Knight Rises, and I think when the cameras come out of IMAX, when they've been completely reconditioned and everything is all, you know, clean and new, they work great. But over time, the way we were shooting them, after a few weeks, things start failing. And the thing that started failing was the Cinetape, which the first, you know, probably 2 or 3 weeks of the movie, I had the pleasure of being able to use the Cinetape. And then it went away. And now come to like 4 or 5 months later, we were doing a shot on the back lot at Universal, a piece of a scene that we missed getting in England. And it's a Steadicam shot, and I have the Cinetape on, which of course is not working. And Chris was always like wanting the cameras as light as possible. And so he sees the Cinetape on the camera and like, Bob, why do you have the Cinetape on there? You said it doesn't work. And my reply was, well, Chris, there's always hope. And he accepted that.
But I mean,
one thing, if I could just add to that I think is kind of unique, and I'll just start it, and Bob, you could fill in the blanks, because it was a relationship. You know, Bob has done all these movies with Chris, like one of his first movies, all the way up until when he stopped. And what's really unique is the relationship between Bob and Chris, the director, and the relationship was so acute that Chris would know instinctively. I mean, first of all, I should just back up. I mean, we talk about how do you prep for the cameras and for big shows, and so the intensity of the prep starts with the lenses and testing them, and everything from, you know, all the marks, all the things we do as assistants. We always check that the marks are spot on, and we shoot tests, we do flare tests. We want to see how they are with each of the different cameras and things of that nature. All right, cut to actually making the movie. And because Bob's done so many movies with Chris, they have a unique relationship where when you do a take, and after the take, Chris would ask Bob how he felt about it. And Chris could tell by how Bob responded whether or not he needed to do another take, whether he actually used the words he needed another one, or hesitated, or things of that nature. And Bob, maybe you want to fill in the blanks, because I've always found that very interesting to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, the reality of that was made apparent to me one night. Actually, it was at the end of Inception. We had ended in Canada, up in the Canadian Rockies. It was just a hellaciously terrible shoot, and we were in whiteout blizzard for most of the time. And we'd had a little impromptu rap party in the hotel bar. And I ended up with Chris at a table, and I think we were both pretty friggin' drunk. And I told Chris the thing that I hate the most and dread the most at the end of a shot is when the director asks me, how it was. Because at that time, I'm not looking at a monitor. I'm just trying to ascertain if I, during the shot, I thought I knew what I needed to do. And if I did what I thought I needed to do, then I would say it was good, but I have no way of knowing if it's good or not. And Chris then said, well, yeah, I know the way that you answer, and I know the tone of your voice. And if I sense a little bit of insecurity, then we'll just do another one. So he didn't even wait for my answer. He was just reading the way that I was looking and sounding.
But then that means that you really have a cooperation in making a movie. Like last week we had a chat about it, where focus pullers have also a relationship with actors, with the director. It's like a team effort to make a real good movie.
Mm-hmm.
And did it ever happen where you said, it's not really my take, and it was in the movie, and then it convinced you that it actually was a good take by seeing the complete movie?
It, you know, if I watch a movie that someone else has done and there's a little bit of out of focus and the acting is good, then I don't even notice it. I don't pay attention to that at all. But if I'm watching one of the movies that I was doing and a shot that I did, and I see it's soft, I still just cringe and can't even think about, you know, why they would have used that. And, you know, it's at the same time, some of the most amazing shots I ever did were cut out of the movie just because of the timing and the way they wanted to edit it. We had, I sort of early on in my firsting career, and this is before remote focus even was thinking about existing. I get a call to go in and fill in for an assistant on a show in Chicago in the dead of winter. I get on a plane at Burbank and it's 70 degrees. When I get off the plane at O'Hare, the wind chill factor is minus 40 Fahrenheit. So that night we've got a shot, hostess mount, which is a mount on the side of a car. So we're going over the passenger to the driver. And the actor is actually driving. In this case, it was Richard Gere that was doing the driving. And at a certain point, and it's a night shot, at a certain point on a dialogue cue, there's a focus rack to the passenger, and then on a dialogue cue, a rack back to Richard. No remote focus. There was the way the car was configured. There was, I think the sound man was in the back seat, or there was not a way for me to get into the back seat. So what they ended up doing was I was strapped on the roof of the car with a Comtex and a fizz. And we're going 20 miles an hour down the street with already 40-mile-an-hour wind chill factor. And I'm listening on the Comtex for the dialogue cue. We do 2 takes. Dailies the next day, absolutely perfect. Timing on the rack, the speed of the rack, it was absolutely perfect. When the movie comes out, they do it in cuts.
That's really, yeah, that happens. I mean, I think about everybody who's a focus puller in the chat can relate to that where you done an amazing focus shot or a oneer and then they'll cut it up and I'm like, yeah, that's maybe a little bit painful to watch also, but well, nevertheless. And in terms of working together with the director or with an actor, Bob, do you have a story about Walk the Line where the lead actor is doing an improvised scene?
Oh, yeah, well, so the scene is in Walk the Line, Joaquin Phoenix playing Johnny Cash. He's in a dressing room in some venue. This is in the early 50s. And I think it was an argument with June, his soon-to-be wife, or something set him off. He was not happy, so he goes into the dressing room and he's smashing his guitar, just tearing up everything. And we knew it was going to be one take, and we were told to be careful because things are going to be flying. And I think I might have had goggles on, but we had a little bit of protection on the camera, not much. So we start the scene. Joaquin comes in the room, smashes the guitar, throws stuff off the counter, goes over to the sink, slams down on the sink. Now, this isn't a set. This is the basement of Holmes High School in Memphis, Tennessee, the high school that Elvis Presley went to. And it has been a kind of a abandoned building for years, but evidently the water is still running. He hits the sink and water just starts spewing all over us. And now the scene is continuing. I'm like getting madder and madder because the effects guys didn't tell us there was going to be water. Because obviously, anytime you see something like that happen, a sink come off the wall, they've rigged it. And now nobody's mentioned that to me. Well, the end of the take, as we're trying to dry everything off, we find out that that is going to be the last take because there was a real sink and they don't know how to turn the water off in that high school, and the room is starting to flood. So we are a wrap.
Amazing.
And what's really funny, and there was a parody movie made of that. I think the name of it was Walk Hard. And there's a whole scene with the actor, smashing a sink and water going everywhere. And I'm sure the people that made that movie had no idea that that was just something unplanned and Joaquin was totally out of control.
But did you got a little bit distracted by it? I mean, you see all this water coming over the camera. I know I get a little bit distracted by it, still trying to focus, but I'm also always concerned about the gear.
Well, actually, I was kind of more concerned about that I'm getting wet. We had other cameras.
Oh, yes, yeah, but you're in the US. I mean, here we have just one, so one on the set. And well, I really like that where a focus puller or a first AC is working together with an actor to make the scene go even better. So I think that's maybe a little bit of an example where you could also have stopped the scene because of the gear, but you went for it and let him have his moments. I mean,
yeah, well, you just, I also came from a documentary background, and as long as something is going on, you keep the camera going.
Yeah. Well, that's not a very extreme circumstance, but Steve, you have been in an extreme circumstance last year on a glacier in Iceland.
Oh yeah, that was extreme. That was an interesting job. I was contacted by the key first, Bill Coe, weeks before I went over there just to ask if I would be available. And I agreed. I didn't have anything. And he gave me a little backstory and full disclosure on what it was like for the first unit and what production was like. And he mentioned that they're not really good at communicating. And so I took notes and things of that nature. A couple of days later, he sent an email outlining the schedule, what he thought it should be and how it should work, when I should start my prep, what kind of staff I would need, and when I should leave the US and prepare the carnet to arrive in Iceland at a certain time. And I had agreed to that, and I put on an assistant that I was going to take with me, and we had a DIT. And basically, the production company that on the first unit and the producers they weren't the sharpest knives in the drawer, let's put it that way. And Bill had suggested that they just wrap them a little bit early and take their whole package over to Iceland. And the producers and the production manager said, no, we don't have time. We have to shoot right up to the time we leave. Then we're all going to jump on the charter and go, and that's how we'll do it. And so consequently, I prepped an entire camera package that mirrored exactly what the first unit had. So that was, 4 cameras, every stitch, every piece of gear that they had, I duplicated. And it was a digital show. So, light rangers, focus bugs, cine tape, everything, monitors, the whole 9 yards. And we had a DIT to mimic everything that the DIT was taking. And the idea was to, take the equipment over there, and the first unit would show up with just their lenses, and they would plug into everything that I had, and we would shoot, and we would shoot for X amount of days. They would go away, they would take their lenses. The second unit would come in, and they had work to do on the glacier as well, and they would bring just their lenses. And then I'd also prepared some equipment for a helicopter, some helicopter work. So that was the idea. And so cut to, weeks went by, and I didn't hear anything from production. And so I sent an email to first I said, are we still doing this? He goes, oh yeah, we're good to go. So there was a production company in Iceland called True North, who, if you've never worked there, they are the best. I would hold them up to any Hollywood production company. They're the people that run that, they're professionals all the way, and they really get it. They're really, really good. So I was contacting them because not only did I have to prep the equipment, but because we were going up on a glacier, I had these vehicles that I had to prep because I'm bringing 4 camera packages up on a glacier, and we have to have specialized vehicles. And there they have these things called super jeeps, and we had these big 8-wheel Tundra type NATO vehicles that had 8 wheels, and some had 6 wheels. I had to make a DIT van, a focus van. I had a camera vehicle. I had something for the directors and things of that nature. So it was a fair amount of work to do. And since I wasn't getting any communication from the US company, I started contacting the Icelandic people, and I needed to know what I was dealing with. So there was a lot of back and forth. And then finally we started prepping, and I still hadn't heard from the American production. And so I'm into the prep for, I think I had like a 2-week prep or something like that. And it was really difficult because it was a very busy time here in LA. And we had to draw equipment from all around the country and the world just to fill our package. So finally, I get a communication from the production, and it was, I need your passport immediately. So I sent it, and then I never heard anything more. Long story short, I just kept dealing with the Icelandic production, and I finally got a ticket. I got a ticket from my assistant and the DIT, and we had to get the equipment there. And the story basically is about having to just be assertive and get the job done, regardless of the information you're getting from production. I never heard from the American production until I got to Iceland, and I was there for about a week. And I met a producer once they finally came over. So the first unit comes over. At that time, weather changes very quickly. So we had to get all our equipment up to the glacier. We had to build out these trucks, these super jeeps. And when the first unit came over, they brought a fair amount of equipment because they weren't sure and they didn't trust what the production would do and how it would work. So we were able to put everything together. We got it up on the glacier, and we shot, and we had some good days when the weather was good, and we had some days when it wasn't so good. And we finished the work with the first unit. We sent them, they went away, and we had to wrap everything out, and they had a very tight schedule because they shot in the US right up until the day they left. They packed their equipment, and they got on a plane, they came over, they offloaded, then we had to prep their equipment once they got there. And then when they finished shooting, they had to prep that night after work, and we had to send their equipment down so they could fly home with it on their charter. And in the meantime, there was an overlap where the second unit came in with all of their equipment. And we then indoctrinated the second unit on how to make all that work. And the second unit is a little bit different than the first unit, as you can well imagine. It's a different set of characters, and their workload was a little bit different, a lot more explosions, guns and ammo, and things of that nature. And so it was a very challenging experience. But what I noticed is that no one ever really told me what to do. So I made my own schedule as we got near the end of the job. In fact, I had production asking me questions about the second unit, when they got there, what their times were, things of that nature. things that are totally outside my wheelhouse, but I had the information anyway. And when it came time to wrap, no one was giving me any information. So I just said, look, we're getting ready to wrap, and this is how it's going to happen. And I designed a schedule. And in fact, I said they wanted to fly me from where I was, which was up in the north, and fly me to Reykjavik and have me wrap out my equipment and go back right away. And I said, no, I can't do that. I said, that's not going to happen. I need time to get the carnet together. The equipment's a mess. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We got to dry it off. We got to, go through this. And in fact, I'd like to have a van so that my guys and I could just take the drive down to Reykjavik, which happened to be a really beautiful day. And we hadn't done any sightseeing. So we took the van down to Reykjavik, and then we proceeded to wrap for a few days and then go home. But I found that in those situations, you have to just be really clear with production on what you need and what you want and how you want to do it. Because what I found is more times than not, especially lately, some of the people who are in production are not as savvy as you would think they should be. And that's my story.
Well, it's interesting because it's the discussion that we had last week about the difference between a first AC and a focus puller, and this kind of is the perfect example of you being a perfect first AC. Like, you run the show, and that's a difference, in my opinion. A focus puller or a first AC, and you clearly, you run the show. So, I mean, they should be very lucky to have you on board.
And then when we started doing the work, I pulled focus on the third camera. So,
yeah, but you run the show. So that's the big difference. I mean, the focus, that sounds a bit stupid then, but that could have been anybody. But the organization and the stuff. And did you lose some gear, or did you got everything back into place? Because it sounded like an explosion of stuff.
Yeah, no, not one piece missing.
Ah, that's amazing. But this was quite large then. So do you remember your first really large shoots, and how did you feel about it? What was your first big thing?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I worked on a movie called Far and Away back in the 90s as an additional camera, which was 65 millimeter, and I think there might have been some 35, and that was huge. It was 1,200 horses, 300 covered wagons, and like all these reenactors. We did. I remember this one big scene was supposed to simulate the Oklahoma land rush, and I was with a friend of Bob's, George Kohut at the time. He was an operator from Chicago, and we were at the starting line up on a platform, and we looked down the line and we could see all these horses and covered wagons. That was huge. And that was a show where when we came to prep, I came out with probably, 10 or 15 assistants, and there was the A and the B crew that were already there shooting, and then had these big scenes that we had to do, and that's what I came in for. And so we had a couple of days to prepare all the equipment and do some tests, and I remember very clearly that was like, it reminded me of what old school Westerns must have been like back in the day in Hollywood, because you had all these old cowboys and all these old stuntmen and wranglers, Terry Leonard, Bob, you probably remember Terry, and I mean, like these guys that were real legends, cowboys, and you see them out there in their element. There'd be, 10, 15 guys sitting around on horses telling stories, and I remember clearly somebody came up and in fact, Terry Leonard was telling a story. Terry Leonard is a legend, a stuntman, cowboy from back in the day. And I remember someone started to say something, and he looked over and he goes, "Timmy, I'm telling a story here." And that the production person just pulled back and let Terry finish telling his story. But it was really enjoyable being out there. It was huge. I mean, the equipment was big. The scenes were big. Mikhail Solomon was the director of photography. And I remember we'd go in for coverage, and it'd be 5 cameras doing coverage. So it was pretty fascinating. That was a big one. And and since then in the last few years I've done, or since 13 anyway, I've been doing a lot of big action units. Action units are a whole different animal. action units on movies like Fast 7 or Bourne, or I did a big action unit for like 45 days in Hawaii on a movie called, I think it was called Kong. I'm not sure if that was how it's released. It was the one with Brie Larson and Sam Jackson, and that was huge. And in fact, the cameraman, the first unit cameraman, is a friend of mine, Larry Fong, and he was telling me that, you know, he wanted to try to get certain equipment, and he couldn't get it because the second unit had all the equipment. And we went in with a director named Spiro Rosados and his stunt team. And those guys are famous for doing all these huge stunts. And they were able to get, you know, the sky cam, the cranes, all this equipment. It was huge. And it was, you know, it's interesting to see how, when you get dialed in with a big action unit like that, how much politically, how much weight they have and power they have in terms of getting things done, especially when you have a reputation like Spiro does. Spiro's done all those, as a director, he's done all the Fast movies and Monster Truck and all kinds of things like that. But the action units, prepping action units, it's a lot like first units, only there's more stuff and there's more guys, and it's often more intense. And when you get out there working on an action unit like that with those guys, you've heard the phrase controlled chaos. It couldn't be more true on an action unit with Spiro than that. It's really controlled chaos. There's a lot of screaming and hollering. And the nice thing about working with those guys is that Spiro has a fellow named Andy Gill, who's his coordinator. And he is, of all the action units I've ever done, this guy is really safe, you know, compared to, say, for example, the guys who did Bourne 5. Who were from England, and I didn't have much faith or trust in a lot of things those guys were doing. Who's that, Bob? Simon Crane, is that his name? Simon, he's
not sure who that was.
Yeah, he's in the Guinness Book of World Record for doing some crazy stunt where he did a free dive from one thing to another. Anyway, he was the director, and those guys are real loosey goosey.
Do you ever say no then when you feel unsafe? Is there a situation where you say, look, great idea, I'm not going to do it?
No, what you do is you make it safe. You stop. It's like, hold on. I always make it a point to go to the AD, to the coordinator, to find out what's going on here. What do you expect to happen? If you're doing an explosion, what do you have in there? Is it primer cord? What are you using? Where are there projectiles? I try to get as much information as I can and pay attention to the rehearsals. You know, especially if it's car stuff or whatever, you know, just try to find out as much as you can. So then you have to make a decision on how you're going to do it. Because oftentimes what they do is they set the camera, they say, all right, put the camera here with a 35 on it, and I want to go 75 frames a second. And so that's what you do. But then you have to see what's around you. And I just try to be really proactive in those situations and get as much intel as I can. To protect not only myself, but the equipment. But nowadays, as a focus puller, you know, you can set your equipment, and if you can get far enough away with your remote and still have it, then you're good. On that movie in Iceland, I had to do shots and things like that where guys would take off and I would lose connection with the Preston. So I had to run out and kind of pick up the signal, and then, you know, bring them in from there. So every situation is different.
So, speaking of explosions, Bob, did you meet Tony on a certain set?
Yeah, when I met Tony Rivetti, and I don't even know if Tony remembers this, I was called in for extra camera work on a movie called Starman. This is back in like early 80s. It was a pretty big movie at the time. And I fly into this location in a small town somewhere in Tennessee. It's a night shoot, get to the set. Tony is already working with the crew, getting a VistaVision camera set up on a hillside. And the situation was basically two like foothills or two small mountains and a valley on the bottom. The scene is a spaceship crashes into the side of a mountain. And for the crash, it was 1,500 gallons of gasoline. Going to be a huge explosion. And there was a little bit of wind blowing, so they didn't know, and the wind was changing direction. So they figured there would be a fireball, but they didn't know which way the fireball would travel. It had rained the night before, so everything was pretty wet, so there wasn't too much worry about things catching on fire. But my camera and one of the other cameras, we were assigned to be down in the base of the valley with cameras to be turned on remotely. And the ADs told me that I should run about maybe 100, 150 feet after I turn on the camera, and then give the okay that I was clear. Well, it was thick underbrush. I mean, it was kind of like a forest down there. And I told the effects guys, there's no way that we can get more than 10 or 15 feet, and that's going to take 20 seconds to do that. And they're running VistaVision up top, so things are going pretty fast. So they decided that they would build basically a doghouse for each of us to hide in. Maybe Panavision was really strapped for equipment when Tony prepped, but the longest remote cable that Tony had was 12 feet. So we've got a doghouse another 20 feet from us. So they have us get in Nomex suits. And we turn the camera on, run, we each get in the doghouse, radio the first AD, Larry Franco, who's very safety conscious, that we're good, and then we duck and cover. And I hear a very loud explosion, and I don't know which way the fireball went, but for a moment, it was the most heat I have ever felt. And then it was all good. So that was my first meeting with Mr. Rivetti.
And I heard that your shot never made it. Your shot never made it into the movie. I heard from Tony.
Yeah, I'm sure it did.
No, so one of those examples. Well, I've been chatting here already for 40 minutes. I think maybe we should open. I don't know how many people are in here, but maybe there are some questions from people who are watching. I don't know.
I have a question. When you're on a shoot where you've got so much gear and you've also got lots of different assistants and 2 units, how do you keep track of every little accessory, especially when I've been in situations where there's just no time to write it in an in and out book or whatever because they just needed it immediately on the other unit, and but you're also doing other stuff, and so it's quite difficult to keep track, and then for it to come back to you, whatever. What's your method for keeping track?
You go first, Bob.
I didn't have a method. We lost a lot of shit. No, that's a very hard one. I mean, just keeping track of the assistant of the equipment just on your main unit without other units and making sure nothing gets lost. I've driven some of my loaders absolutely insane trying to keep track of everything on a computer, and it's just hard. I know what we started doing. Been doing this for, I think we started doing it in 2008 when we had really good digital cameras. For returns, we started photographing everything that we were returning rather than trying to write it down. And so then when the rental house tells us that we're missing something, then we've got a photo of, no, we had this return. So it's somewhere in your house. But hopefully Steve has a better system than I have.
I don't know if it's a system or just kind of methodology. As I said, in these last few years, so many big shows, big action units, multiple cameras, things like that. And just working with guys, like Bob and some of our contemporaries who, we just really just keep after it. I'll tell you a quick story. On Mission Impossible 3, I was doing a unit. I think it was a second unit. And sometimes the first and second unit would be together. We had our own trucks and things like that. The second unit, we probably had, I don't know, 6 or 7 cameras, a lot of assistants, and sometimes not that many assistants would be on every day. I was, I think, B camera on that. And so I was on the whole time and we traveled everywhere. But the assistant, who's Baird Steptoe, who some of you know, American assistants, you'll know Baird. He's one of our contemporaries. He was the key first on the second unit. John Connors was the key first on the first unit. And Connors, when our equipment was there, if they needed something, they would just go to your truck and get it. Well, we didn't like that, right? So we had a trailer at that point, which was this beautiful, modern, new 5th-wheel trailer that had a screening room in it and all this stuff. It was great. So we would take it to Panavision and tell production that we had to clean the equipment, and just so these guys wouldn't take our equipment. And it wasn't that we wouldn't share, it's just that they wouldn't tell us when they would share. So that was one way. All right, cut to more modern days. I rely heavily on my assistants, and every camera, whether it's A through D or whatever, every camera crew is responsible for their equipment. And especially when you travel, if you travel, for example, I did a unit a couple of years ago. We went to South Korea for Black Panther, and we had to provide the carnets because oftentimes we bring our own gear as well as the rental gear. And so it's very specific. And every unit, every camera is usually a first, a second, and an operator, but the assistants, you look after your own gear. And sometimes you do have to share. Sometimes you might have something that goes down or it's not working right, and then you need something in a pinch, and so you go get it. But it's really just keeping, looking after it and making sure at the end of the sequence or at the end of the day, you get it back. So I always put the responsibility on myself or on someone else. And, I have a reputation, as we all do, and we just don't like to lose anything. I mean, sometimes things break. One of my first shots on that Kong movie, I think I had a buck, which is the shell of a helicopter, and it was being ratcheted right. My camera was down low in what I call a crash box. It was, and I had a camera in there, and the thing hit it, and you could see, the filter popped off and this and that, and so sometimes things get broken, so that you report that, you put it on the production report right away, and then you get it replaced. But unless something like that happens, you just really have to be responsible for everything. Make sure your assistants and all the other people, they stay after it and they return it. Do color coding really well, fundamental stuff like that. But it can be nerve-wracking, because especially when you have, 10 or 12 cameras, or, you do these concerts where there's, 30 cameras, and then it's like, it's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, but still, be gentle. It's a rental. I mean. Yeah,
totally.
We all should stay friends with our rentals. I know one of my friends is in the chat, Aiden, and he has a question. Aiden, and you introduce yourselves also, please. When it's your turn, let me know who you are, where you're from, because I would like to know.
What classification is, or if you're a focus puller or what? Yeah.
Yeah. So the next one up, Aiden.
Yeah, sure. Hello, my name is Aiden. I'm a 600 camera assistant. I'm based in DC.
Right on.
So I had this is like a two-parter. It's basically just that I just want to ask about Dunkirk, just because I know that was kind of a whole experience in and of itself. But Bob, you had a great quote in the ASC mag about the time that you guys crashed an IMAX camera into the ocean. And then I know Steve also had a great story about.
I didn't do it. They did.
Yeah. And then Steve had a great story about just some of the rigging. for the aerial shots. And I know there's like Panavision made the probe lens and all that stuff. So if you guys just wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, the losing the camera, we've on three of the, well, I think I did 3 IMAX movies with Chris, and we damaged an IMAX camera. There was only 4 of them, but we managed to severely damage one on each show. But what happened on Dunkirk, and IMAX had come out with a new version of their high-speed camera that was similar to the MSM that was our regular camera. And they had made 4 of these new cameras. And so in this particular case, we were using one of their brand new IMAX cameras. And production comes to me one morning. We're in Holland, in Urk, getting ready to go out to the sea. Excuse me. And production says, wants to know if if we have an underwater housing for the IMAX. And I'm like, well, don't you remember in production meeting, we talked about it's being retrofitted. Pete Romano in Los Angeles is taking care of that. And we won't see it until August, until we get back to Hollywood. And they go, okay, well, that's not a problem. The effects is going to build one this afternoon. And I'm like, that's not really a good idea. So, oh, no, it'll be fine because we're just going to strap it on the wing of an airplane and catapult it into the sea. And I'm like, that's not going to be a good idea. And I said, no, it's going to be perfectly fine. The plane is made out of balsa wood and styrofoam. It's just going to float. Nothing is even going to get wet. And in case it does get wet, we have divers in a rib boat that'll jump in immediately and save the camera. So next morning we get there, and I send Steve over because he's the guy that I send to do all the really nasty stuff that I don't want to have any part of, to oversee what they've done. And they've got a plastic 50-gallon oil drum with a Lexan front on it, and they're sealing it up with butyl, and that's what they're going to put on the wing of the plane. So we steam out. We're about 45 minutes out from the harbor. We do the stunt. The cameras are rolling. They catapult the thing, and this was supposed to be the POV of the pilot landing on the water. So they wanted to see the water, and that was the shot they wanted. What happened was the plane immediately went nose up, tail hit the water, sheared the tail off, and it sank like a rock. And we're like, okay, well, we see the rib boat with the divers, and everybody on the rib boat is just standing there talking. They're like waving their hands around. And then one of our California boat guys, we see him rip his shirt off and get a rope. And so he dives down about like 4 or 5 meters and attaches a buoy to it so they could recover it. We had divers on the rib boat, but they had decided to leave their dive gear at the harbor. So they'd have to go back and get it, which would mean a minimum of 90 minutes. So it was about 2 hours later, the camera finally gets back to shore. And it was rather wet. I've got to say that we got, there was a discussion on what to do with the film because the camera ran. And anytime the camera runs, the film goes to the lab. That's just a rule that you never break. The only lab that could process 65 millimeter was Photochem in Burbank, California. Now we're in Holland. Now, domestically, we've gotten cameras wet or film wet. And the theory is you put the magazine in a pail of water, have the driver drive it to the lab, and it'll probably be fine. We had to ship internationally, and you can't send a bucket of water international. So after long discussion with Photochem, they decided that our loader would take the magazine into the dark room with a big pail. We'd already tried to drain a lot of water out of it, and would then take the film out and hold it up and sort of shake it, get as much water off of it, double bag it, put it back in the can, and ship it and see what happens. And when we got dailies back from that, it was absolutely amazing. The shot itself was completely unusable for the film. Basically, it was just a shot of sky and then all of a sudden sinking in water. There was no negative damage. The last maybe 3 feet of film had emulsion damage, but other than that, no damage at all. Shipping a wet roll of 65 millimeter international and no damage. That was amazing. The camera, however, took $250,000 of repair, and they finally got it working.
Yeah, that was a real challenge. I remember when Bob sent me over there, and dealing with the effects guys, and it was talk about controlled chaos. Everyone has their own work to do. And when I got there, it took a look at what was going on. The effects guys, all they wanted to do was drag this thing out on the barge and get it set up to put it on the catapult. It's like, well, hold on a second, dude. I got to put a camera on here. I got to figure out how are we going to power this? How are we going to secure it? How are we going to turn it on and off? All the things that you do when you rig a camera like that. And where are you going to put this thing? And they showed me what they wanted to put it in. It's like, I'm thinking to myself, no fucking way, man, that's not going to work. But that's all they had. And yeah, so a lot of challenges. And I remember the next morning, I was actually out doing some aerials, and Chris had come over to get in the helicopter, and I asked him how that went, and just narrated the story that Bob told me. He goes, yeah, it went great till it hit the water, and the guys couldn't rescue the camera because they left their stuff back at the dock. And even these big movies, they don't always run as smooth as you think they might. But
well, I think it's a great story. And when I look at all the faces in the Zoom, everybody goes like, yeah. You can actually relate and you feel it.
You can't help but cringe. But I have to tell you, cut to coming to the States, and we went to the back lot of Universal. Up there's a lake, they call it Falls Lake, and they had built big blue screen, but they had built a rig of the ship, right? And the ship was on it wasn't gimbal, but it was on this pole that they could make it turn over, right, as it was sinking. And our guys, our effects crew built a similar thing, and I think we just had a little bit more control over it. And we were able to do those shots. If you remember the movie, as the ship is sinking and guys are there and they're going off the boat, and then the whole thing goes in the water. And those things worked really nicely for us. But we learned from our mistakes as well.
Well, that's always good, right? I mean, that's what happens to everybody. There's a next question from Sam. And I wonder where he's from.
Hi there. This is Sam. I'm from Vancouver. I'm 6'9", from Vancouver, BC. My question is, it's kind of related to prep. What happens when kind of on day 2 of a show, prep kind of goes out the window? I did a show where we were doing anamorphic and spherical, and on the second day, they decided to only use zooms. And we had only had a 19-90 and a 12-1. And we needed an extra 19-90, and then we needed anamorphic zooms that kind of matched the look that they were going for.
Yeah, well, go ahead, Bob.
So let me restate the question again.
It's just kind of like when all plans change on like the second day, and you've already done prep and you've already kind of checked distance on all the lenses, and they decide to go with a completely different set.
Yeah, well, you do the best that you can do, and you hope that you've got a good crew with you to help you. Yeah, I've been in that situation many times, and probably the worst time was I got hired to do a show that was going to be it was a Western up in the Dakotas. And the equipment was coming out of Wilmington to a facility in Los Angeles. And this equipment rental house, it was a very small rental house, and they had shipped just tons and tons of gear to this facility in Los Angeles. And we started opening up camera cases, and the first two cameras that we opened the cases, they're completely broken. And we end up, it was going to be a 5-day prep. We end up on the 4th day making the decision. Actually, it was 5th day. In the morning, the DP came in and saw the lens test and said, "We're out of here." We left all the cameras set up with the film still in the mag, and just walked out of the facility and drove over to Claremont Camera and prepped a feature in 1 day at Claremont. So and I had really good team with me. So that's when you need to hire the best people around, is to be prepared for these things not going smooth. And usually things don't go smooth on the prep.
So that's, Bob speaks the truth. I mean, I think probably a lot of you on this call can attest to it. I know sometimes you're throwing a curve like that, and so you really have to adapt to it. So you just do the fundamentals, right? You know, you get the equipment, you take a look at it, you put it up, you measure it out, you shake it, make sure there's no loose elements, things like that, and just see, does it work, number one. And you know, you kind of start there, and sometimes you don't have the luxury of all the technical equipment that you have when you're at the rental house to actually check lenses and test them, or shoot a flare test, or put it on an MTF machine, or things of that nature. So when you're in the field, you have to do field tests as best you can. And if you have any doubt about anything, then you just send it back. But you know, I've been in those very same situations where, especially when sometimes there's political bullshit that goes on that you're just not aware of. For example, I was on a show, and the pilot of the show was shot in anamorphic. They set the look, and it was really cool, blah, blah, blah. The studio loved it, and that's what they wanted to do. So I was prepping this series to with anamorphic, and the production manager didn't understand why it takes so long to prep anamorphic, and so I had to explain it to him. But then when we got up there, so I prepped in LA, and we had to go up to Utah, and then we get there and we get ready to go, and then unbeknownst to me, the cameraman that was shooting the series didn't shoot the pilot, but he wasn't really keen on shooting the thing in anamorphic. Well, I didn't know that. And so he knew guys that, Bob Forrest at Panavision. So he had a whole set of, like 2 different kinds of lenses set up, right? And so all of a sudden I go to the stage one day, and there's all these lenses there. And it was a day we were supposed to do hair and makeup tests. And I was like, well, what's going on here? And he goes, well, and he tells me, he goes, well, I didn't really, I'm really not keen on doing this. And I just want to prove to Don Johnson, I think was one of the producers and the actors. He wanted to prove to the producers that he could make things look good in spherical, just as nice as they look in anamorphic. So it's like, wow, I spent all that time prepping, and now here they're just going to throw in all this stuff at me. And so that was one of those situations where, it had nothing to do with anything but that. A cameraman just didn't want to deal with anamorphic, and so we ended up changing. We changed to spherical, and all super speeds or primos or whatever it was. Yeah. So those situations, you'll find those things come up during your career, and you just deal with it the best way you can, and just always try to cover yourself, make sure. And as Bob said, a lot of times things like that will happen. They'll just show up, and you might be in the middle of a shot or something like that. So you have to have your guys that you could delegate to and say, look, check out this gear and make sure it's really good or whatever. And that's really important too, to have people that you trust that can do all that work for you.
Okay. Next up is Friso, which is my Dutch colleague. Where are you?
Unmute. Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, thanks for talking to us. I'm Friso, Kokspuller from Holland. Didn't get to work in Urk, but I heard stories about that. The whole area was like sealed off and no one could get in or out. But I did get a chance to see that one in the original 15 perf 70mm in London. Did you guys ever get the chance to see it the way it was intended?
Oh yeah. Yes.
Okay. Because there's like one city in Europe in London they can project it in 70 15 perf.
Right. Yeah, I saw it that way, and I think there was also, Bob, correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't IMAX do some kind of large format digital version? That
Yeah,
I didn't see.
They did.
Yeah, they did. They did a digital version. I mean, there's such a difference in seeing the projected film I mean, there's a difference between the digital and projected film, and almost nobody gets to see what projected film feels like anymore, which is kind of a shame, but you know, things are always changing.
I got to tell you, there's. I just want to just rewind for a minute to when Bob and I were doing The Dark Knight. That some of the highlights of the day were, Chris always had a screening room. We would always go to dailies. And I remember, Bob, they would call wrap, and then Bob and Wally and Chris, they would run down for the IMAX dailies in Chicago. They would go to this place called Navy Pier, which was the only place that had an IMAX theater. And so Bob would take off right away, because as soon as they said wrap, they would go and they would want to see the dailies and things of that nature. So we'd be cleaning up and wrapping, and in my, it was, for me, it was, I've always wanted to wrap quickly enough so I could see some dailies. And I'll never forget the one day, I got there, and it's like a big stadium, right, where you see the dailies for IMAX. It's amazing. And I'll never forget, walking up, the dailies were already running, but I was walking up, looking over my shoulder at, this big, huge 5-story screen of the guy on the bike and lower whacker. And it's just, I remember having the feeling, this is why I got into the business, for this. And it was one of those moments. You don't get them very often, because you just don't. But that was one. And I was like really like happy and proud of that. It was amazing.
That was very freaky and surreal, working 12 hours all night, doing these incredible stunts. And then 7 a.m. in the morning, before you even get to sleep, you go in and you're seeing this in IMAX and Heath Ledger, 80 feet high. It was a little disconcerting.
You guys crashed the IMAX camera on Dark Knight as well. Not you guys, but the people
Dark
in the decision making process.
Chris used IMAX. He got the idea when we were doing The Prestige. We had a scene in The Prestige where they brought in an IMAX camera, not the MSM, not the one we ended up using, but it was the really big, bulky IMAX camera. And we did a scene with Christian Bale at a dressing table. It was going to be him and his twin brother sitting together at the dressing table. And we were basically told that Chris was doing it in IMAX because he needed it for the visual effects, which most everything we were doing for visual effects was done with a VistaVision camera. And so we thought it was kind of odd that this scene, which didn't really seem that it needed IMAX, that Chris wanted to use it. But Chris wanted to see what it was like, what the process was with it. And from that little experiment, he decided that he could do a whole movie that way.
So I don't know if you heard my question. There was another IMAX camera crashed on the Dark Knight production, wasn't there?
Oh, yeah. We're doing a high-speed chase down Lower Wacker. Lower Wacker in Chicago is a roadway that goes along the river. And it's at the level of the river, but the street level of Wacker is one story above that. So it's kind of like this tunnel that sometimes is open where you can see the river, but most of the time it's just a big tunnel that's like maybe 6 lanes, I think. And we had a garbage truck that the scene was, it's sideswiping cars. And I'm in the ultimate arm car, a remote camera car with the crane on top of the car. And we're preceding the garbage truck. And it's hard to remember exactly what happened, but
Know exactly what happened.
Hit one of the cars that spin this way, and then it sideswiped another car, and that car spun, and our IMAX camera was in between the two, and our driver didn't accelerate fast enough, and it got smashed in between 2 cars. So we immediately, everything stops. By the time I get out of the ultimate arm car, Steve is already on site. I think he was in a second camera car that was going along by the side. And the magazine has been ripped off the camera, and there's a hole in the side of it, the size of a baseball. And so Steve is crouching by this magazine with his hands over the hole in the magazine. And another one of our assistants runs up with photo black tape, tapes over the hole. And fortunately, night shoot, we're in basically a tunnel. Not much light is getting there. With the wind of the film, it ended up being fine. We saved the film. And they
And the day.
worked on the camera for years and years. They kept, I know that I got called in on a Michael Bay movie that he was doing in IMAX right after that, just to do extra camera with an IMAX. And we had that camera and it was still screwing up, but they eventually got it fixed.
So we're talking all these big productions, the blockbusters, the IMAX, the effects, the explosions, the chases. Isn't it just a lot more fun to do a movie like Sideways, which is one of my all-time favorites?
Sideways was,
I've seen that one 5 times at least.
that was such a fun movie to do. The location was basically 90 miles from where I live, but they were providing hotel rooms in Solvang. And so we could, on weekends, we could stay in wine country or go back home. So it was really a great location. Alexander Payne was only working 7 to 8 hours a day. He said he'd heard the crews talking about how they worked long hours, and he didn't know what he was doing wrong. He didn't know how to stretch the day out any further. And we're shooting in these wine tasting rooms that are tickled to death to have us. And at the end of the shoot, they start bringing out their best preserved bottles of wine and pouring and let us taste. And we've got our transportation department waiting to take us back to our hotel because none of us are going to be in the shape to drive at the end of that. So it was just an incredible movie. On Dunkirk, even though we're in France, we don't even get wine at lunch. So Sideways was much more fun.
Okay, thank you, Friso, for your questions. I liked it. There's a question from Gunnar. Is he still here? I don't see him.
Oh, I'm here. Do you
Oh,
hear me
here you
now?
are. Yes.
Hi, Gunnar Mortensen, camera technician, which you guys overseas don't know what that is, but that's even better than the first AC. It's a union, like when you're creme de la creme, and in the union you get tech rate, and you're a camera technician. So, I have an interesting story. I've only heard parts of it, but Bob, he had a pretty interesting experience with Dennis Hopper that I'd like you to kind of go into a little bit more.
We did a movie that literally, I know that none of you have ever seen it. It didn't get a release, and it ended up being released on cable 4 years after we made it. We actually had a cast and crew screening 4 years after the film was made. The cameraman was, I don't want to mention Ed Lockman's name, but it was Ed Lockman. We're doing a scene with Dennis. We're on location in New Mexico, and it was a very important scene where he's making a decision basically about what way his character is going to go. And the scene is he's on a highway, his car is parked on a highway in New Mexico. He's got a burrito, which those of you that aren't familiar with Mexican food, it's a unleavened bread, a tortilla wrapped around beans and all kinds of greasy meat and stuff, very kind of sloppy. So he's holding that in his hand, and he's got to give a line. He takes a bite of the burrito, and then he gets in his car, and we see him drive off. We had messed around with lighting on the scene for most of the day, and we had run out of time. So now the sun is going down, and this is a very key scene for Dennis. And he's very astute about filmmaking and the needs of what a cameraman needs. And he realizes that the sun is gone. This is not going to match anything. There's no time to do the thing right. And he's lost getting to do the important scene that he wanted to do all day long. And in his displeasure and seething anger, he gets the burrito and aims to throw it at our cameraman, Ed Lockman. Ed happens to move a little. I kind of not really aware of what Dennis is about to do. I move a little, and Dennis's aim is not that great, and I get a wet burrito right in my face. And that's a wrap.
Well, that's good. And I know you guys have worked together for a good portion of your career. What was the first movie that you guys worked on together? You and Steve.
Something about Trouble in Tokyo, Showdown in Tokyo.
Right. Brandon Lee, Showdown Little Tokyo. Right. That was the first time. All right. I mean, I remember there's a lot of different things. I remember Italian Job. There were a few things. You came in on a Tony Scott movie we were doing at one point.
Well, after, I mean, the Showdown in Little Tokyo, that Steve was the lead assistant on that. And I came in just for like one day on an additional camera, and watching how Steve worked and how he conducted himself, I was very impressed. And for that time on, if I needed an experienced person to come in that would not screw up, Steve was one of the first on my list. And it's worked out over the years.
Yeah, it has. I've got to tell you a funny story since we're telling stories. So Dunkirk, the way that came up was kind of interesting. I don't know, maybe Bob, you could give I'll give a part of it, and you can give a little bit of lead in. I was actually, during that time, I was doing something when they were prepping in Panavision for weeks, prepping all that equipment. And I remember going in there because I'd worked with that crew before, and I don't know, I might've been doing something else. I can't remember exactly, but I remember walking out of that room one day just before they shipped out, and I was thinking to myself, man, I'm glad I'm not going on that movie. Anyway, cut to, someone called me to do a unit for the movie with, I think it was called Luca, the guy with the Wolverine guy, Hugh Jackman. Is that called Luca? And I needed to take like 2 or 3 Libra heads and some cameras down to, I think, Mississippi. And the production manager called me, and the lead assistant for the first unit called me and told me what was going on. I said, okay, great, I can do that. And so I was prepping Libra heads, and we were trying to figure out remote stuff and wireless and this and that and the other thing. And I was talking with production. I didn't have a lot of confidence in the person I was talking to because of the questions they were asking me on why I needed this and where I was going to put my gear, really fundamental things. I was feeling a little nervous, like they didn't really understand what I needed. And then the assistant who hired me said, well, you can't bring anybody, you got to use somebody down there. And I know what that meant. And what I was doing was really technical, and then it was going to be like an array unit. So there was going to be a little bit more challenging, and I needed to have someone that I could depend on. So I called production and I negotiated for an assistant, and that all worked out. And so I prepped all the equipment, the Libra heads and this and that, and I shipped it out on a Tuesday. And I was supposed to fly on a Thursday. And Wednesday morning, the production manager calls and I said, Steve, I'm sorry, I think we're gonna have to push this a couple weeks. And I thought to myself, oh, great, so you'll give you time to figure things out. And then shortly thereafter, I get an email or a text from either Jonathan or Dan, one of Bob's A guys who were with him in Dunkirk. And it was just a kind of a generic text that says, hey, you know, what are you doing? What's going on? We're thinking of making a change. And I thought to myself, I wonder what that means. And I think, Bob, you sent an email. At some point, I think somebody sent an email and they said, yeah, full disclosure, you know, it's a shit show. We're thinking of making a change. Are you available? And I thought to myself, well, these are my guys, you know, because I've worked with these guys and I know, you know, there's something about when you're working on a team and you're with guys that you've been with before in challenging situations and maybe it's not the best, but if you got your core group of guys around, you have that strength in numbers, and you know, you always feel like you can do anything. So I said, yeah, sure. So the production very quickly called me and made a deal, and then I found myself on a plane. The next thing I knew, I had an IMAX camera on my shoulder, and I was climbing up the side of a destroyer out in the North Sea that Monday, and that's how it happened.
Well, the way that came about, in my 40-plus year career, I've only been directly involved in getting somebody on my crew replaced. And this instance was not because the assistant was not good at his job. It was, Dunkirk was a political quagmire from the start. It was Chris's first low-budget movie since Memento. It was the lowest budget he had worked with since Memento. It was $100 million that they had. And basically he got that budget because he went to Warner Brothers and said, I have a movie that I want to do, but I want full control over it. So how much money will you give me to stay out of it and not have any input? And they said, well, we'll give you $100 million. So that was what they had to work with. So Chris ended up with a production team that was not of the caliber that our previous production teams had been, especially the UPM was more of an accountant background. And you guys all know where that goes. I'm sure that you've dealt with a lot of UPM accountant types. And his line was always, you know, there's Chris the producer and Chris the director. Now, Chris the director might want something, but Chris the producer is not going to want it. And this was this guy's first movie with Chris, and that's not the way Chris works. During pre-production, Chris is the producer, and he makes all the decisions. Once he starts directing, he's the director, and what he wants, you need to supply. And in crewing this up, we had a lot of aerials, a very important part of the film. And the aerial crew had an assistant that they had worked with that they wanted to have, which was totally understandable. Had it been a bigger budget movie, which is kind of odd to say, we would have had a complete separate unit for the aerial. That's not the way Chris works. We generally have 2 cameras on Chris's movies. We'll have many more bodies than that, but 2 camera crews. And on all the movies, the way that the B camera crew functions mostly is in a leapfrog fashion. They will go set up the next shot, and I would have both the cameras, all the equipment be absolutely identical. I was kind of the dictator in that respect, and the B camera had to be exactly the items that I wanted to use. And B camera crew would set the camera up, walk over with Chris and Wally, and Chris would start directing, Wally would turn the camera on, and I'd have my hand on the wheel. So it was a very tight group in trying to get that to function. And of course, in a situation like that, where you've got a crew setting up for you, you need somebody that knows how you want to work and will work along those lines. You take a job and you know, okay, this is the deal that I've been told to do it this way, and this is the way that I need to do it. And so part of the time, the B camera assistant was with the aerial crew, but then part of the time he was with us. And although we had a lot of cameras, there was very specific items we didn't have that many of. And what was happening was, since he'd been hired by the aerial crew, he was, trying to please them basically more than pleasing us. He was seeing that as his main job. And Chris was seeing that usually when we'd send the aerial crew out, we'd say specifically, you can have this, this, and this, because we know that Chris needs this. And unfortunately, that was not happening. He was taking backup things for his unit to make sure that he was in good shape. But we never ran into a huge situation where we were out something and couldn't figure out a different way to do it. But I mean, Chris could tell that we're a little stressed over the situation. And then unfortunately, one morning we're going to work, and the B camera assistant is driving himself to the aerial location, and we pass him as he's going the opposite direction because he's read the directions wrong or something. And basically he's an hour to 2 hours late getting to the aerial unit, and Chris knows exactly why aerial unit is not taking off, because he's seen the assistant going in the wrong direction. So later in that day, somehow Chris and I are scheduled for having to go pee. Seem to always be together. And it was almost a kilometer from the end of the mole to where the honey wagons were. And so I'm going that kilometer walk with Chris, and Chris is going, Bob, I think we need to make a change. And I said, Jill, I've been worrying about that, and I think that would be the best. And I said, but I don't know that there's anybody that knows about IMAX cameras. And I said, well, I think I might know somebody. I think, a gentleman that we've worked with before that you had a very good time with might be available. And that was when I radioed for the initial text to get to Steve. And unfortunately, and in the email that I sent him, basically I said, you're walking into basically a field of landmines with this crew, because I've just fired their guy.
Yeah, and I have to say, I remember my first mag change. The pilot thought I would work better if he left the rotor spinning, and I thought that was odd. And I didn't realize until later that he was a friend of theirs. So And I knew all those guys. So anyway,
Yeah,
it's
no,
interesting how that.
very early in my career, I had been working with a first assistant as a second just on occasion. And a show had come up that they were adding extra cameras to. I remember at the time I thought it was a really big show. And I was talking with the assistant that I wanted to go on to it. I was still very young in my career. And he told me that he wasn't going to hire me on that. He was going to hire somebody else, basically because of the politics of what we were walking into. And at the time, I didn't quite understand what he meant by that. Cut to 38 years later, it was like, yeah, I get it. Politics can play a big part in what you're doing on the set and your crew.
Totally. And it's not only with assistants, it can be with operators, girlfriends of DPs, all kinds of things. And that's when you have to practice your professional ethic.
Copy this. We have all been listening. There's a next question from Will.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, hello guys. My name's Will Kulick. I am a first assistant out of Atlanta, Georgia. I'm currently here in South Carolina for some R&R. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, it got touched on last week, and I wanted both y'all's opinion. With the way it is now, I know back in y'all's day when y'all had film, y'all had rehearsals, y'all blocked everything out, and there was a bit of a system. But in the digital world today, there's a lot of on the fly, oh, let's just throw the camera up and let's just go. We don't have time for a rehearsal. As a focus puller, I mostly keep focused like on wide shots, two shots, but when it gets into close-ups, what communication do you have with the DP or the director, even the actors, as far as on who to focus to, on when, just to get those story beats that they're looking for? Like, how do you handle those conversations? And who do you go to first and foremost? Because that's kind of a gray area for me.
Yeah, sure. You want to go, Bob?
Yeah. I'll, who you would go to first, and boy, I've been in that situation so many times, and that's the way things seem to be done now. And what's changed over the years is that we actually have the technology with light rangers, cine tapes, and focusing devices that we have a little better shot at getting a good take when we're doing something just extemporaneously. Who you go to depends on the relationships you have with the people on the set. If it's a director that you have a good relationship with, that knows you, that you think he knows what he wants, which is the key, because a lot of these situations are done because honestly the director doesn't have the foggiest clue what he wants. And a lot of directors, the way they operate is they need to see something before they know it's wrong. So that kind of goes into it. But if you know the director and you have a good relationship with him, even back before digital, I was always going to the director, wanting to get his input on, where focus should be. I mean, early on in my career, I was fortunate enough to do movies with Nestor Almendros and Robert Benton. And Benton was a very approachable director. And he actually wanted me to come to him to discuss the focus, because his theory was, and a theory that I carried through the rest of my career, is that who you have the focus on in a shot dictates what the director is trying to say in the shot and what's important in the shot. And that could actually not even be on the actor that's speaking. In the movie Pulp Fiction, one of the most dynamic shots that I think in that entire movie is a scene with Bruce Willis with a very large black bar bouncer gentleman that the camera is over his shoulder. So you just see the back of his head, and then you see Bruce here. Bruce totally out of focus. The back of the bouncer's neck is sharp. And that's how the entire scene plays throughout all of Bruce's dialogue. Another instance of that was a movie that I did. It's a courtroom scene, and on the defense bench, we have 3 Academy Award-winning actors. The way the director wants the scene shot is my focus is on a glass of water on the desk, and the 3 Academy Award-winning actors are out of focus during their shot. So that's a communication that you have to get from the director. Right. Now, if you don't trust the director, if you think that he's a nitwit, which sometimes, you know, you're in a situation to have that opinion, then I would go to the DP and discuss with him, you know, what do you think would work best for the shot in this situation? We had an instance on a movie. The movie was called 4 Christmases with the Reese Witherspoon. And we had a shot, it's a night shot, cameras on the front porch of this old house, looking across the porch. And in front of us is Bobby Duvall, Robert Duvall, in a rocking chair. So focus starts on him. Our other actor goes to the door to knock on the door, and Duvall seems unaware of him until he knocks on the door. And at that point, Duvall turns to the actor gives his line, and Duvall never looks at, actually Duvall doesn't turn to him, but on the knock, no, I'm sorry, screwing up the story. He turns, we throw focus to that actor, he delivers his line, Duvall comes back to profile, we come back to Duvall. That was the rehearsal. Worked fantastic. And the operator and I are like, great. Jeff Kimball was the DP. He thought it was great. Now we do the first take. Duvall doesn't turn. So I throw the focus to the other actor, and the shot works, but it's not as dynamic. And we don't have Duvall coming back profile, which was the strong part of his character in that shot. Was he comes back to profile and the focus goes to him. So we go to the director, who is a new director. Vince Vaughn was the other actor, and Vince Vaughn was the producer of the movie, and he was calling the shots. And early on, he had told the director that if he would stay in the shadows and not say anything, that he would let him finish the movie. And we had Vince Vaughn's writing partner, who was kind of like co-directing. The guy wasn't even DGA, but here he is like giving the actors lines and things. So Jeff Kimball goes up to the director and our sort of wannabe director and says, well, we need to have, Kimball's from Texas, so he's got a pretty thick accent. He's go, well, we need to have Bobby stay facing forward until Vince knocks on the door, and then he looks, because then, you know, we come back to Bobby, and profile is really strong. And our would-be wannabe director goes, no, we can't ask an actor to do anything. And fortunately, Jeff goes, well, hell, I think I can ask him. So he goes up to Duvall and says, now, Bobby, we got a great shot here, and it's working out really good, but one thing will make it better is if when you hear that knock on the door, you look to Vince, and then you turn back, and then we focus back on you, and we got a strong close-up of you. That's gold to an actor. You tell an actor you got a strong close-up, they're gonna keep their eye right on the camera.
You know, I'd like to say something. to that too, Will, because you know, every shot, every show, directors, actors, everybody's different, you know, and situations are different. And you know, your question on who do you go to, who do you speak to? I mean, I totally agree. You know, depending on who your relationships are strongest with, and I mean, sometimes I go to the AD, and especially if you got a critical shot, it's a 3-point move, or if it's a dolly move and you're up and down, and it's delicate, and you need marks. You have to speak up, and you have to say to, you know, maybe it's an AD, maybe it's your cameraman, maybe it's your operator who can help you with that. But you know, in today's world, where especially in, you know, different types of situations, that whether it's long form or whether it's you know, whether it's something, you know, shorter episodic TV, and the schedule is just, it's all about the schedule, and they don't, you know, oftentimes they don't know what you do. They don't realize that you need time to do things. You have to figure out the dialogue to get what you need. You know, and as Bob said, you know, we have the luxury nowadays with the technology, whether it's a light range or a focus plug or whatever. But still, even with that, you need to have an idea of what you're going to do. You know what I mean? Especially if it's something complicated. And I mean, that you should have an operator who would want to know what's going to happen too. You know, there are so many situations over the years where, you know, back in the day when we were on the camera and we were just right there and we could see what was happening, and you're real close with your operator, because sometimes your operator would do something and he would say, all right, now I'm going to go here, or bring the focus here. And so together, it's like a choreography. Today, I think we see a lot more focus pullers hanging back off the camera on a monitor. And so you're removed a little bit. And so I think it's incumbent on the first to pay attention, you know, if you get a rehearsal, to see what's going on. And if you don't get a rehearsal, you know, understand what's going on with the shot, with the scene, so that you can make really good choices when it comes time. But just to get back to your question, like, who do you speak to? I think it's, you know, Bob gave good advice there. It's like, you want to see, you know, who's really paying attention here. Because sometimes you get these guys that are nitwits, you know, and they don't really care until they see something that's not working. And then it's like they're going to start pointing fingers.
Yeah,
So,
and even with Chris Nolan, I stopped asking Chris who to focus on. Basically, it was after I told him a story that I had heard about Tony Rivetti, and this was on the movie Unforgiven with Clint Eastwood. Tony did most of Clint's movies, and when they were having camera scratching problems, and so Tony had left the B focus puller on the set. He was on the truck trying to figure out, you know, where the scratching was coming from. So the B focus puller, not as you know, used to working with Clint as Tony was. At one point, they're doing a shot where you've got Clint and another actor, and the assistant goes up to Clint and says, "Sir, who do you want me to focus on, you or such and such?" And Clint just looks at him and goes, "Do your job." And basically, you know, the assistant, what he was saying was the assistant should know who to focus on. So after I tell Chris that story, there are many times when I would go to him when there was really a question of, like, dramatically, you know, it's one or the other. Going back to what Benton told me, was that, you know, I'm changing the dynamic of what's important in the scene. I would go to Chris and go, who do you want in focus? And he would always go, "Do your job."
I love this story. I really do. I hope the next question is just as good. Analia, am I saying this right?
Hello, everyone. It's Analia.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No worries. I'm a focus puller and first AC. My question is not technical at all. I was wondering, what's that thing, that one thing, or what is that one feeling that you love about focus pulling? Thanks.
when it's sharp.
Yeah, it's the feeling of accomplishment. I mean, what what makes life interesting for us, and what makes a job interesting is basically problem solving. Anything that gives us pleasure from the job that we're doing, you can take that back to problem solving. Any job, anything that you do, any task basically is a problem, and you get it right, you solved it. So you feel good. So like Steve said, when it's sharp, then you can feel good.
I agree. I think that's well said. I also find and have found that over the years, when you're doing a shot, when there's because the business we're in, it's a handmade business, right? I mean, if the camera's on the dolly and the guy's pushing it, and you have the actors have to be at a certain place, and if there's a lighting cue, and when you have all these different elements and they all come together, and the choreography all comes together at the same time, and the performance is good, there's a real sense of accomplishment there. You know, when all the beats, especially, you know, you get on, sometimes I've been on these situations where they're really complicated moves and dollies and some prop here, or they're moving something out of the frame as you're going in, and then, you know, multiple things, and then you end up on some beautiful shot, you know, and those things are really, really rewarding. At the same time, it's really great, you know, I've rigged 2 cameras on an airplane in Dunkirk, and he goes out and he's got a camera in the nose, a camera in the tail, and it's really rewarding when you know that you set the hyperfocal right, and that the on and off is going to work, and you got enough juice in the battery, and the film's loaded properly. That's an accomplishment, especially with IMAX. So I think, you know, all the different situations, you know, they present different, you know, levels of accomplishment. And it's really on what you bring to it, and how you approach it, you know. That's how I feel. You know, I still enjoy it.
All right, there's a last question from Aurel.
Yep.
If I'm saying this right.
That sounds about right. Aurel. Hi, my name is Aurel. I'm from Munich. I've been playing focus for about 20 years now. So my question is more of a general development in the style of how you pull focus. Because obviously earlier on there was a lot more rehearsal time, and now with more improvisation by the actor, but also by the operator sometimes, you know, gimbal, steadicam, whatnot. Do you still get the time to prepare properly for a shot, get your marks, or how do you approach it? Can you pull without a monitor still?
The way I approached all the changes was I retired.
So I'm still active, and I try to, it really depends on the situation. I took over another show that just came out called Extraction. It's with Keith, what's his name? Hemsworth. And it was an action movie. And so there's situations where I will have my focus, my wheel right with me, you know, Preston. And I like to be there because I like to see what's going on, especially if it's an operator I don't know. And I had an operator on that movie who, he'd come in, he'd find a frame, and then he'd go like that, another 6 or 8 inches, you know, consistently. And so, you know, when you're wide open, you know, 6 or 8 inches makes a big difference when you're on a longer lens or on some kind of delicate move. But there are times when you just can't physically be there with the camera, and then I'm back on the monitor. So for me, it's you know, I make those decisions at the time. Then there's a movie I did recently called, not too recently, a couple of years, called Captain Marvel, and which was with Ares 65, and that's also was really critical. It was a lot of wide open, and I wanted to be back with the DIT so that I could see playback from, he had a high caliber monitor, and I could see playback immediately to see if there was motion blur or if I had really buzzed it or not. And I found it more valuable. And even though that was a big movie on big sets, I still found myself being kind of boxed out because of the way the staging was and the blocking was. So when I have something that's really complicated and I need it, then it's like, I need to get a couple marks here. And I make a point to do that. And usually I don't have any resistance. When I stand up, I'm 6'4". I don't know what meters that is, but so I can.
We also don't know that in feet, so that's okay.
When in digital, the hard decision that I would make on every shot that I just till the end struggled with is, where should I be to do this shot the best? You know, if I would love to be at the camera, that's where I'm used to being, but I'm also used to getting feedback from the operator. But if I've got an operator that is looking at a little monitor, doesn't even, a lot of the younger operators don't even know they're supposed to look for focus. I mean, working with Wally, we actually, if we had some soft shots on additional cameras, we would look to changing the operator before we would change the focus puller, because Wally's deal was, you know, the operator can always reach down and grab the knob. Of course, back then, that wasn't when we were on remote. But just the decision of where should I be? Should I be at the monitor? If I got an operator that is not sure of being able to see focus or can't see focus, and then you look at Village and they've got like an 85-inch monitor and there's 20 people watching it. If I have a soft shot, do you think one of them will say something? Maybe not. Maybe none of them are paying attention. They're all on their iPhones. So a lot of times I would look at my surroundings and go, the only person that can judge whether or not this guy's in focus is me. And I need to be able to see, you know, it on a monitor to do that. With the advent of things like the Light Ranger, Preston's Light Ranger, it made it, you know, a lot easier to be working at the monitor. We had, you know, but with shots like Steadicam, I always preferred to be walking along with Steadicam. We did a movie a few years back called San Andreas about, it was a disaster movie about an earthquake in LA, which we, of course, filmed entirely in Australia. But we've got a scene in the movie that it was a 3-minute scene of when the earthquake starts. It starts in a restaurant on the top of a skyscraper. And there's a little dialogue scene at a table, and this is all Steadicam. And then another character comes in, there's a little interaction, and then everything starts shaking. Then explosions start. There's an explosion in the kitchen. And then our leading lady gets up, she runs out, and as she runs out, there's explosions here, there's glass breaking, there's things falling. And a 3-minute shot like that, I thought, I just got to be next to the Steadicam. And so we went through a couple of rehearsals. Oh, and it was also a 8-hour reset between takes if we screwed up. So that added a little bit of stress to it. So we do some rehearsals, and I'm doing everything just fine. I can stay there with the Steadicam guy, and just before our actress runs into a stairwell, I back up to this one point, which is the only point that I can get to and not be in the shot. And the effects guy goes, we have a propane bomb right here that's going to go off. And it was like, okay, I'm going to be doing this on the monitor. And we got the shot in maybe 5 takes over a period of like 3 or 4 days.
That's pretty amazing. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, those situations are always challenging. On the same movie I was referencing before, Extraction, there was I think the movie starts with a oneer. I can't remember, but
yes, it does. Yeah, I love the movie. Sorry, it's just it's amazing.
It was weird the way I got hired for that one too. I was hired first to go over and shoot the rehearsal, which was the oneer, and I remember, you know, a long flight to India and then getting right into it, and you know, the guy who was shooting the oneer was a stuntman. Right? It wasn't even an operator. Sam Hargrave, was a wonderful guy, and he's done a lot of work as a stunt guy. He did that really interesting fight sequence in Atomic Blonde on the stairway, and he did all the work. So I'm just there to babysit the camera and, you know, focus it while they're doing this whole wonder. But I mean, these cats are all stuntmen, and I just got off like a 15-hour flight, and they want to start running up and down the stairs and up to the roof and here and there and all these fights. And it's like, I was huffing and puffing on that one. But yeah, every situation is different. You just kind of roll with it.
Cool, thank you.
I think that's it. As far as questions. Ah, someone's nodding yes, yes. Yes, I think we're done. Bob and Steve, if you could please stay in the chat, I would love to ask everybody. And thank you all for joining us. You can all see it back on the website, on the forum.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
I loved it. So
Yeah,
if you guys can stay on, I'm gonna ask everybody to please leave the chat. And next week we have a Spanish version. Oh gosh, I need some help with the names of the guys that are coming. Oh, I don't need help, sorry. Next week, same time, same place, in a new version. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a good life, everyone.
Stay sharp, everybody. Keep it sharp. Be professional and be nice.